Thank you, Michael. Thank you for the invite here today. It's great to be speaking at European Supply Chain Day. It's a great opportunity to bring experts together to discuss the challenges that we hear about every morning almost. When we turn on the news, there's just some new challenge and with a dynamic world. So obviously this is a very big topic. So I decided to take a little bit of a logistics stance on it and sustainability stance on it. I'm thinking about where we were in the past and maybe where we want to go maybe in the future. And I will try my best to stick to time. So I'll just pop that off so I don't be looking at myself. Okay, so what we can see obviously is a world in flux. As I said, the news this morning in the last 2 weeks even demonstrates that even more so. Geopolitical tensions, climate change, pandemics, technological leaps, and also global supply chains, they're constantly changing and are constantly being challenged. And a bit like a roller coaster, you know, there's lots of ups and downs and peaks and dips in the approach to supply chains and the stability and variability that is necessarily impacting them. And so what we're looking to look at this session is to explore some critical elements of resilience and also thinking about sustainability and how sustainability links with resilience, and of course the whole technological development and the future of supply chains. So there are, of course, challenges, but sometimes when there's challenges, there's opportunities, and of course there's transformative technologies that are there in terms of shaping the future of global logistics in particular. So if we look at what's necessarily happened of late, particularly from a logistics perspective, and we look at some of the statistics, and we've already alluded to particular Minister Canny in terms of the importance of ports and the importance for ports for trade, and Ireland being a small open economy on western fringes of Europe, and the importance, of course, of the efficiency and effectiveness of logistics to supporting our economic development is key. So we know that 90% of Ireland's international goods are traded via sea in terms of volume. And from a worldwide perspective and an EU perspective, we can see 80% of world trade volume is carried by sea, which is expected, was expected to grow with the changes, I suppose, over the last 2 to 3 weeks. That is, of course, a key question, and what the impact will necessarily be in that regard too. And obviously on an EU level, looking at non-EU countries in terms of trade, 2,406 billion euro in 2023, approximately 47%. So ports very much we see are critical infrastructure, and as we go through it, we can see the impact that necessarily would have on Ireland, and we've seen that recently. For example, we have some statistics here from UNCTAD looking at the disruption from October 2018 to September 2024, and pretty much looking at the Panama and Suez Canal and looking at the transit dips in those aspects. So we can see from the Suez Canal perspective a massive decrease in the amount of ships transiting it, particularly avoiding it because of the Houthi and the Red Sea. And we can also see another key connectivity and a key infrastructure, the Panama Canal, due to climate aspects having low water levels, have reduced transitions to it also. So ports are obviously a very key critical infrastructure that we need to obviously monitor, support, develop, invest. And we know there's been issues around capacity, post-COVID capacity issues, particularly around going into LA in particular. But also we know we have looking at our own capacity at home in terms of Dublin Port in particular, and what the needs will be in the future to support our economy, to support our trade and logistics opportunities. But also we can see in terms of the freight cost index as well, looking at the Panama Canal and the Red Sea disruption, and these statistics also from the UN Trade and Development Association, UNCTAD. So we can see there's cumulative percentage change in its breakdown in terms of the cost. So in this aspect, we're looking at the container index, the China Container Freight Index, which gives us a good idea about the cost of freight from some key ports in China to key routes around the globe. And we can see that's almost a 200% almost increase in June 2024. Of course, this has kind of come back down to more normal levels at this particular point. But it just shows, it demonstrates, the vulnerabilities that are there in terms of infrastructure in particular. And vulnerabilities, we could also talk about, risk. What is the risk and how do we necessarily go about mitigating some of those risks? So what we can see is a single point of failure can, disrupt the whole system, the whole global system, whether it's the Panama Canal or Suez Canal, or whether it's actually closer to home, what we've seen recently in terms of Holyhead Port example, the impacts of weather, the impacts of Brexit. So, of course, when we focus on ports, we talk a lot around our home ports in terms of Dublin Port and the Irish ports, and thinking about their capacity and their efficiency and their future effectiveness, which are really, really key. But of course, they're part of a system. And as Minister Kenny was talking about this morning about the Welsh Task Force being involved with them and working collaboratively, which is important because we are part of a bigger network in terms of our port infrastructure. And also something that CILT Ireland has been working with CILT in Wales to work collaboratively in how we can actually work together to support the I suppose, resilience of our logistics and transportation infrastructure. So we know there's a ripple effect. We have global disruptions and impacts across the supply chain, what can lead to costs, delays, shortages, rerouting, and there can be a multitude of different factors. They can be on a macro level, or they could be within your own particular supply chain as well. So it has massive impacts in terms of manufacturing, retail, healthcare, other types of critical sectors. Look at COVID, the pandemic, and trying to get PPE equipment in particular. And also the geopolitical instability and trade wars create a lot of uncertainty in terms of what the future will necessarily hold. So there's also increased consumer expectations for the constant availability. So we do see a lot of variability, I suppose, upstream, but also we need to think about some variability downstream as well. And I think the example from the previous presenter around the toilet paper for COVID and behavioral aspects also come into play and to take into account. So what we've seen in terms of supply chains, you could argue that globalization was very much driven by cost minimization, maybe a lean approach to supply chains, and trying to minimize that cost and get the right product at the right price and so forth. And so there's an argument, of course, for an alternative strategy, which would be around agility, flexibility, and endurance. And obviously that would mean potential change for many organizations. But this is probably something organizations need to think about. Is a lean strategy still appropriate for them in this very variable and dynamic world? And we have a number of mechanisms we tend to look at when we talk about agility within supply chain management. We talk about anticipation and mitigate the variability. So what would be the risk within that chain? Where are necessarily the pinch points? And we saw quite a lot of focus on that, of redesigning chains, or actually thinking about how we would like our supply chain to work and how we would necessarily design that. And of course, that means you need a lot of data, you need a lot of information, you need a lot of planning in relation to do that, to understand the supply chain. And we have, of course, in the past looked at supply chain mapping and looking at the key flows for some of our products and to do that. But of course, that is a very vast and expensive and resource-dependent exercise to achieve those elements. And we also talk about building structural agility into our supply chain. So integrated planning, or collaborative planning with some of our key strategic partners. Can we maybe have elements around co-location, so we're located on the same campus, for example, but also in terms of our logistics and third-party logistics providers. So are we building, I suppose, capacity into the system? But then, of course, is there going to be a cost associated with it? And there's always that cost-benefit analysis there. And also, we think about the plans and what we can foresee, but we don't have a crystal ball. So operational reactivity in terms of agility teams, problem solvers, and a culture in terms of how we would necessarily go about responsive elements and how we would go about finding solutions to those potential problems as they emerge. So we can't necessarily foresee all problems, so we do need to have an element of response potentially in there. Alongside, of course, the element of change and maybe short-term change in terms of shocks to the systems and variability, there's an ongoing element towards sustainability and the drive towards sustainability as a core imperative. And we're seeing a lot of a change within, I suppose, policy and requirements, and we'll touch upon some of those as we go through the rest of the presentation. We're seeing a growing importance of the environment, ESG aspects in there. We're seeing reducing carbon footprint as a key aspect as well, circular economy principles, reducing waste, promoting recycling aspects in particular, and also fair labour. So there's more burden on supply chains in order to look upstream and what the impact is necessarily having on maybe developing countries in particular in terms of the social aspect and fair labour approaches. And also we're looking at consumer demand for sustainable products and practices increasing. So there's changes in the broader marketplace as well. So we need to be looking not only upstream, but also downstream to our customer base of what tastes and changes in fashion in particular. And we're seeing a drive in terms of these sustainability factors. So we have, in terms of government regulations and policies, we're looking for the target net zero by 2050 for logistics at a European level. And we're going to see the ETS2, where we're going to have transportation coming into the emissions trading system, looking at 2027. So that will be, I suppose, a broader influencing factor in terms of how organizations look to minimize potentially their emissions from their transportation and their logistics aspects as well. We also see investors' expectations, particularly around ESG reporting requirements. And we have, of course, in terms of the scope 3 elements that are coming into play for the larger players having to report their non-financial aspects in terms of emissions reporting too. And that's going to create a driver, of course, throughout the supply chain as looking to reduce those emissions within their scope 3 reporting. So we're also looking for cost savings through energy efficiency and waste reduction. A lot of organizations looking, of course, for a win-win. Can we have green, but optimization also benefits our bottom line, which is a key benefit for organizations. But the question will be, as things go forward, can we maintain a win-win, or will we have to potentially pay more in order to get that green credentials? And then, of course, we have technology advancements enabling sustainable practices. And some of these technology advances we've alluded to already today in terms of digitization, but also, of course, we have physical or hardware technology advances, whether that's biomethane or methanol in terms of our shipping going forward into the future. So it's not only the digitization technology, it's also the hardware technology that can help us in terms of reaching our sustainability goals. I'm just going to skip through the sustainability goals and concentrate on some of the upcoming broader policy aspects. So we have the carbon border tax, the CBAM initiative that's coming into play, initially focusing on some of the high energy use industries, looking to avoid and diminish carbon leakage from the European system. So looking to create I suppose, a more even playing ground, that if you're importing from outside the EU, that you will also have to pay these carbon tax on those goods that you're necessarily importing. Again, this is a challenge for many organizations in terms of data and what that would necessarily mean and how that would necessarily impact our supply chain and how we would need to potentially minimize that disruption. Does that mean we're going to necessarily what the calculations will be, but also what changes we might need to make as an alternative. As I mentioned already, there's going to be requirements in terms of scope 3 emissions, and that's probably going to roll down to more smaller to medium organizations in time, as more organizations are going to be required to report their scope 3. So not only the direct emissions and their emissions from energy, but looking at the challenge, and that is a huge challenge for many organizations to get around to understanding the data, understanding what their emissions are upstream and also downstream in their supply chain. So an incredible challenge for organizations to get through. We also have this CSRD, so looking at a unified reporting framework. We've had quite a lot of frameworks in terms of corporate social responsibility, whether it's the GRI framework or Sustainable Accounting Standards Board. And of course, we're looking to develop that into a corporate sustainability reporting directive to a more integrated framework as organizations will have to think about how they would necessarily deal with these and be CSRD compliant in the future. So logistics is obviously a key element within the supply chain, and there are, of course, some potential solutions for logistics decarbonisation. And I've borrowed some content from the Smart Freight Centre based in Amsterdam, which has some very good practical advice in terms of solutions for logistics decarbonisation. So freight demand growth needs to be managed. In terms of maybe looking at your supply chain and restructuring it. We've heard so much about localization in terms of reducing your carbon emissions, reducing the length of the transportation chain, and nearshoring. And this became, friendshoring as well, became very popular discussions post-COVID in particular. But I do wonder sometimes, when you hear of a crisis and you think about agility, and of course you need to get the products and components, otherwise you don't have any product for your customer. But I wonder then, do we kind of revert back to the cost pressures that might amount to us? And that might be one of the impediments that could reduce organizations looking to be more agile, or maybe looking to nearshore. But of course, with the dynamic nature of the last week or two with tariffs, of course, will maybe speed up that potential process also. And without going through all of these points, there's a reference list in my slides, which we can make available to you if you want to look at this further. Of course, optimization is always key as a win-win. I suppose something that I always kind of think about is particularly empty running and reducing empty movements of goods. And we've talked about this probably for the last 30, 40 years and the amount of empty vehicles on the road. And I think it's something that we haven't maybe made as much progress on as we would hope to have had over the last 30 years. But again, maybe digitalization might be a potential aspect to help solve those key elements as well. So we're talking about, transformative potential in relation to digital technologies. We're talking about blockchain, digital twins, so we can simulate and optimize supply chain rather than actually working directly within the supply chain itself. We can, simulate those types of environments and what the impact would be looking at those changes. So we're seeing quite a lot in terms of these transformative technologies that can potentially help us. So it could be in terms of proactive risk assessment, identifying vulnerabilities and developing mitigation plans to reduce those vulnerabilities within the supply chain. It could be going back to more traditional planning approaches, or it could be using something like scenario planning, which we've been using in other areas of planning, but maybe not so much in supply chain planning, to look at the bigger picture and how we can necessarily get people into the mindset and the culture of the organization towards and looking at technology adoption and thinking about agility and thinking about the risks and mitigations within the supply chain. So resilience is going to be one of the key elements, I think, going forward, and even more so what we've seen in the last few days. And just conscious of time, I'm just going to skip on to the physical internet in particular, and maybe some examples that we might want to think about of how organizations are using technology or starting to use technology. So the physical internet is, and I suppose, EU driven. We have this physical internet by 2050, this open logistics system that's interoperable, that will find the most efficient, low cost and optimized way to getting from A to B across the EU using this hub system. And we've seen quite a lot of investment in this technology in the different phases of this, from Horizon Europe funding, which is 80-something billion euro. A lot of universities and research organizations across Europe, of course, very much focused on that type of funding and how we develop the different stages of interoperability of this. So the physical internet, I suppose, is the end point for EU in terms of looking at the focus for sustainability and also thinking about this interoperability. But there's a long way to go before we necessarily get there. I think there's a long way to go from a technology perspective, but also there's a lot of questions around what's the future business model for logistics if we're going to have this physical internet and interoperability between open logistics systems rather than the closed logistics systems that we have today. Just to briefly mention some of the real world impact, Unilever, for example, and SAP are using blockchain, green token in particular, and IoT sensors to look at the origin and journey of raw materials. So they're looking at sustainability aspects for deforestation and free palm oil, and being able to give reassurances, I suppose, to consumers that they are not, I suppose, damaging and they're protecting valuable resources and vulnerable resources in the environment. And Stella McCarthy, another example in terms of ethical practices for their suppliers and how they enhance transparency for consumers and encourage more sustainable choices. But quite a good example that I use actually in my teaching is General Motors, who use predictive analytics for supply chain risk and minimize disruption. So they've mapped their tier 1 and tier 2 supply, and they have predictive analytics, which they've used for hurricane impacts, particularly in America, and what the implications would be for its tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers, and adjusting its production planning, and working with some of those key suppliers to pull things forward as are needed to avoid and minimize disruption to their chain. So looking ahead, thinking about some of these key elements. So some of these are not new. We've talked about this from supply chain management for a number of years in terms of managerial desire, looking at what the challenges are. And we've seen quite a lot in terms of supply chain development, particularly around the automobile industry, kind of leading the way, a lot of the big players leading the way. We still see a lack of integration. We know integration is key in terms of working together collaboratively, and we still see a lack of supply chain perspective. A lot of organizations still focus on themselves rather than their supply chain system perspective. And it can also be an inconsistency around procurement and the role of suppliers, and inconsistency in terms of expected applications. So again, we're thinking about the collaboration, we're talking about infrastructure and technology, talent in order to come up with potential solutions, and also to develop resilience within the supply chain. So I suppose the one key element to kind of focus on is we talked about visibility, we talked to having information to make the right decisions and having the right data. And what we're actually seeing now is the technology that's able to facilitate that. And we've talked about it maybe in principle, but now we've seen certain elements of it being implemented by quite large multinational organizations as well. So I think the future, of course, will be around digitization. It will be around optimization in particular, but also we'll see a lot more in terms of the physical technologies as well. So thank you very much for listening to me. I think we will open it up for questions. Michael, over to you.
Thank you very much. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them into the question box. I might just start though with a question that kind of dawned on me as you were presenting on, I suppose, in the era of escalating geopolitical tensions and trade disputes, I'm just wondering, just in terms of your own opinion, how do you feel businesses might balance the need for global sourcing efficiencies with the imperative of building resilience and, I suppose, regionally diversifying their supply chains? And I suppose, what are the associated economic implications for that as well?
Yeah, it's a really good question. How do we deal with this, and how do we do this? We obviously want to keep our costs under control when we have to report our bottom line, but obviously we need to get the goods in the door in the first place as well. And I think we might start seeing more dual strategies. Potentially we look at what we potentially will source from China, or could we potentially be using Eastern Europe as well? So do we have maybe a backup plan as well? But it's quite a difficult thing, because if you start tracing all the way back through the supply chain, back to some of the key components, as we know, it only takes one small element to disrupt it. It could eventually end up being in China. So this whole mapping, traceability is really a key aspect too. But we did start to see some of the automobile industries, in particularly the US, starting to deleverage some of their supply chain. So those that were in China, they were saying, well, if this trade war does kick off and there is a disruption between the tensions between the US and China, which was building for a while, we could see it from the chip element as well in terms of the technology aspect. So there was some evidence that the automobile industry was quietly trying to deleverage and potentially having two chains, one that would be focused on the USA, and then one that would be focused potentially on China, if there was that barrier to trade between the two countries.
I have an interesting question here. In what ways can talent development and digital upskilling of staff contribute to enhancing supply chain resilience and achieving long-term sustainability objectives? And what specific competencies are essential to support this transformation?
Yes, I think this is a really excellent question. And I think this is something we've been working on in terms of data analytics with some of our master's supply chain students in particular. Those key skills are really essential just to be able to work with data, analyze data, download data. What are the trends? What are they now? What analysis can they do? What insights can they necessarily bring from that? So we do require talent, and increasingly we need digital skills, and it's going to be more so within the future. And my question would kind of almost be for myself as well, as we talk a lot about digital skills and supply chain excellence, and we're very much focused on quite a lot of the large players in here as well. But I think we need to remember around the SMEs too as well, and the support that we potentially need to give to them, because they don't necessarily have the resources or expertise that a lot of the large multinationals have. So I think there's a lot of potential there for support for professional bodies like CILT, and also policy and support as well from government to help the SMEs and where they fit and how they can also benefit from this type of digitization. But talent is key. If you don't have the right people, you're never going to be able to achieve your goals.
I have a question here. How do we reframe the drivers of sustainability within companies, tying resilience to sustainability to manage risks across the supply chain?
Yes, that's a very good question. I think some of those have to be driven quite centrally. And what we've seen in terms of some of the logistics optimization, some of the studies we've done, particularly around alternative fuel adoption of HGVs and biomethane, a lot of the drivers have actually come from central corporate headquarters and how they can necessarily drive the decarbonisation agenda. So having a decarbonisation plan, what is the roadmap that you would necessarily have and what targets you would necessarily need to achieve? Sometimes that could be maybe externally driven by customers as well. And we've seen a lot more sustainability in procurement. There would be a question, some people would have a caveat, how seriously, tenders and other questions, sustainability is necessarily in there. But a lot of it is around KPIs, and we do say, be careful what you measure, because it does potentially become the culture of the organization. But also, I think there needs to be a learning organization, and all of these elements need to have a change management process potentially in there as well. But it links back to your previous presentation that was there in terms of a fish with a dead head, I think was the expression used. That it does, a lot of this has to be driven from the top in order for it to be successful, and you need that support from the top.
My final question is, what security risks are available to increase, or security measures, should I say, are available to increase technology links like blockchain across supply chain in heavy regulated industries such as pharma?
That is a good question. I won't say that I'm an expert in that level of digital technology aspects, but of course, cyber security with an increased digital world will be key, and global warfare at the future will probably be around cyber security as well. So definitely something to very much consider when you're adopting digital technologies. But I think I would leave that for a more techie expert to answer that one.